An entire deck based around trap cards and normal monsters might make it seem like we're playing caveman Yu-Gi-Oh! But these ancient ancestors of ours have some Cambrian explosive plays. So here's how Paleozoic works. Every Paleozoic monster is based on a different form of life form, some point in the Paleozoic era, whose names are pretty much the same as the creatures they're based on. Paleozoic Canadia is based on our best approximation of what we believe an animal from the Canadia genus to look like based on fossil evidence. Dinomischus is based on what we think a Dinomischus could look like, and so on and so forth. These strange-looking critters are some of the earliest known forms of complex multicellular life in our world. And while Yu-Gi-Oh! Is comprised of many different dimensions and universes, there's a chance that primeval relatives of the Blue Eyes White Dragon and Summon Skull were once trying to escape the clutches of Paleozoic Anomalocaris as they fought for survival. These animals lived strange and complicated lives filled with mysteries that even researchers in the real world are still trying to unravel. And fittingly enough, Paleozoics and Yu-Gi-Oh! Play in an unconventional way that might take a while to get used to. Because, unlike most other strategies, Paleozoic doesn't really have any kind of combo that it relies on. Instead, every one of its trap cards each has its own powerful utility effect, alongside a graveyard effect that allows them to bring themselves back to the field as normal monsters in response to an on-field trap card being activated. These monsters have pretty mediocre attack and defense, but their ability to gradually form the field backed up by powerful trap cards gives the strategy a chance to snowball from setting 5 and passing to popping off into a bunch of extra plays while drowning in an insurmountable amount of advantage. As a result, your first turn with Paleozoic is always going to vary, and it isn't going to be initially indicative of what you'll be doing later in a duel. But here's a simple combo to show how the cards work. If you start off with Paleozoic Marella, you can set it alongside a generic normal trap card of your choice, whether it's Ice Dragon's Prison, Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon, or even a Needlebug Nest. All you have to do now is simply pass turn. And then, at your first opportunity, use Marella during your opponent's turn to foolish Transaction Rollback and resolve the chain so that Marella goes to your graveyard. After that, just activate your on-field trap card whenever you feel like it to either disrupt your opponent or gain some advantage, and then, if your opponent doesn't have a response to that trap card, you can chain the effect of Marella in your graveyard to special summon itself to your field. And because you use Marella to set up Transaction Rollback in your grave earlier in the turn, you can now banish Rollback from your graveyard to use its effect to copy the effect of the trap card you just used, even if that card has a hard once per turn attached to it. So with just Marella and any other normal trap, you not only have a way to use a trap effects twice in one turn, you also have a free body from Marella that you can use on your second turn to access some pretty crazy extract monsters. This doesn't sound like too much at first glance compared to what other combos can do. But remember, Paleozoics are all about slowly reoccurring and regaining advantage. And over the course of a duel, this one Marella can eventually turn into an unoutable board. But before we call ourselves true paleontologists, we need to examine the impressions made by our fossilized friends and understand the distribution of their species by looking at the deck's ratios. When playing Paleozoic Labrynth, you can limit the Paleo pool to just playing 3 copies of Paleozoic Marella to send Transaction Rollback and other powerful trap cards to your grave, as well as potentially a copy each of Opabinia and Anomalocaris, since there's a chance you might end up making them. Meanwhile, a deck like Paleozoic Tearlaments will often expand that package to playing 3 copies of Dinomischus alongside Marella. With Marella, this deck has some excellent trap cards you can send with its effect to gain you more advantage. While Dinomischus can not only act as removal, but can also discard Tearlament cards from your hand for effect, allowing you to trigger their graveyard effects. But if you're playing Paleo as a pure strategy, you almost go all in to assure that you'll either draw them to use their strong effects on field, or mill them so that you can bring them out from the grave, with 3 copies each of Dinomischus, Canadia, and Olenoids to act as your archetypal forms of disruption and removal, alongside 3 copies of Marella and 3 copies of Lynchia, which can manipulate your graveyard and banishment resources to your advantage. And then, once these prehistoric playables become monsters, you can use them to go into the deck's archetypal payoffs, like a Paleozoic Opabinia, which you can usually play at 2 to 3 copies because you might actually end up going through all 3 during a game due to how grindy Paleo is. Likewise, you'll be playing Anomalocaris at 2 copies for much the same reason, although it is a little bit harder to access since it requires at least 3 level 2s rather than the 2 you need for Opabinia. It's also worth it to play at least 1 copy of Paleozoic Anomalocaris, because while it's definitely not as reliable as your other extra deck tools, having it in availability as a utility option that can allow you to deal with your opponent's back row while protecting your own can actually be a game changer in certain board states. However, even if you're playing Paleo as pure as possible, there are some members of your own archetype that just aren't worth playing in most cases. Specifically, Paleozoics Pikaia, Hallucinagia, and Eldonia are usually skipped out on. Like the other Paleos, these cards can still be extremely useful by bringing themselves back as free bodies that you can use as form of your field for extra plays, but their effects as trap cards leave something to be desired. And because Paleo is a deck trying to eke out as much advantage as it can, drawing an unimpactful name like these three instead of your other better Paleos can sometimes be disastrous. Now that we've looked at the fossil records, let's take a deeper dive into looking at these aquatic animals and see which ones are fit for survival and how our deck might evolve over the course of a game. Each of the Paleozoic trap cards have two effects that are important to know. Their first effects are unique to each Paleo and are your main ways of interacting with an opponent, and it's usually this effect that determines the playability of each trap card. But no matter how weak or strong a Paleozoic's first effect is, they each all share a second effect that can be activated once per chain in response to a trap card being activated to special summon themselves as level 2 aqua-type monsters that are unaffected by monster effects, with the only real downside being that they'll banish themselves when they leave the field. In Paleozoic-focused strategies, this effect is, bar none, the most important in the deck, and how you will use it will often determine your victories and losses more than anything else. Because if you can use it effectively, Paleozoic becomes an almost impossibly grindy strategy that's capable of out-grinding, out-resourcing, and out-gunning even some of the strongest decks in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Because despite their low stats, standing at only 1200 attack and 0 defense, if your opponent lets you keep a couple of Paleos on field, those monsters suddenly become really powerful assets that can easily convert into an ocean's worth of strong rank 2s, from the archetype's very own Opabinia and Anomalocaris, to combo enablers like Gigantic Sprite, and of course, Totally Awesome, all of which are great ways to leave your opponent lagging behind in the evolutionary race to regain their resources. You can also convert your Paleozoics into a number of different link options of your choice as well, because none of them lock you in any way, but putting them under an Xyz monster specifically does something very important. You see, in most cases, when you use a monster for an extra deck play, the monster is leaving the field, which would mean that when you use your Paleozoics for a fusion, synchro, or link summon, your Paleozoic trap card will then get banished by their own effect. However, when using monsters as Xyz materials, while they may no longer actually be on the field, they haven't left the field according to game mechanics, nor would it count as them leaving the field when they're later detached from an Xyz monster. For Paleozoic, this is incredibly important, as it means that your traps won't be banished by their own effects when used for an Xyz summon, which gives this strategy an excellent way of recharging the graveyard with resources so that you can bring out the same cards later, all while making a bunch of powerful boss monsters. And the best part is that even though you'll be summoning out Paleozoics during your opponent's turn a lot, they're more than likely to survive long enough to reach your turn so that you can actually bring out these extra deck tools, because despite being normal monsters, they're entirely unaffected by monster effects. This is another vital aspect of the utility as monsters, because while they are still subject to the likes of Raigeki and Dark Hole, the most accessible forms of removal in the modern era are monster effects that are usually attached to generic extra deck tools, and archetypal boss monsters that your Paleozoics are completely immune from. Even your own monster effects won't do anything to move a Paleozoic. And while that can sometimes be a downside since you'll struggle to use them as fusion materials for a Telemint fusion summon, but it'll also mean that bringing out your own Zeus to wipe your opponent's field is going to do almost nothing to impact yours. However, there is still one way for monsters to remove your Paleos from the grave. They can just destroy them by battle, and given their pitifully small stats, it's pretty easy for most decks to be able to contest your field of anomalous ancestors with their battle phase. Thankfully though, there are quite a few options available for Paleozoics that can be used to deal with this glaring weakness, with the likes of Rise to Full Height, Threatening Roar, and Wabaku all being shockingly effective staple choices for the deck, because with their lingering effects applying, your Paleozoics are immune from both battle and monster effects, virtually guaranteeing that they're going to survive the turn for you to start your comeback. And the best part is that these battle faders are all multi-purpose. They're not just amazing at protecting your Paleozoics, they're also trap cards that can be activated pretty easily with no difficult activation requirements, which is amazing for the deck as you can use these traps as both defensive tools to protect yourself and your Paleos, or as offensive options to summon out more Paleozoics from your graveyard to swarm your field to push your opponent's board. In fact, pretty much every generic trap card you can play in Paleo is going to have the same purpose, which is why the traps that pilots will usually choose to use are carefully selected, as you need them to have high impact on the game state, while also being something that you can activate at most points during a duel so you can bring out more Paleozoics from your graveyard. This is especially necessary to think about due to the way the graveyard effect of your Paleozoics work, because this effect is a quick effect that needs to be activated in response to a trap card. Notably, this means you can only use the grave effect of your Paleos when a trap card specifically is used, because if you use a trap card effect that's currently face up on the field, or a trap effect in the grave, that doesn't count as a card being activated. It is an effect instead. So having on-field trap cards that you can reliably activate to bring out bodies is almost essential for getting your turn 3 plays going. But that's not all. You see, when you activate a trap card, your opponent will get the first opportunity to respond to it in every instance before you get a chance to use your Paleo effect. And if your opponent ends up responding to your trap card's activation, you won't get a chance to chain a Paleo to summon it out. Which is why, against Paleo strategies, it's a pretty common tactic to throw out random quick effects to cut the deck off from summoning out its bodies, as it drastically slows the strategy's resource game. But if you're a Paleo player, an opponent is going to run out of quick effects eventually. So having enough strong chainable trap cards in your back row will often be enough to get your play started at some point. All of this is, admittedly, a lot to take in at once when discussing just one effect. But it's a good idea to know its intricacies to get the most out of your Paleos. And thankfully, it can be boiled down to a few easy objectives to follow when playing the deck. Get your Paleozoics to the graveyard, ensure you have chainable trap cards so you can bring them out from the graveyard as monsters, do what you can to help them survive your opponent's turn, and then, once your opponent passes, use your Paleo monsters to bring out a bunch of powerful Xyz monsters that will also refill your graveyard with Paleos to bring your resource loop out again once they're detached. But of course, despite how powerful this effect is natively, not every Paleo trap card is created equal, and some are definitely better than others by virtue of their first effects. Out of all of them, Marella currently stands at the top of the food chain with its simple but powerful effect, as when you activate it, you get to send a trap card from your deck to the graveyard. Even if you limit yourself to just sending Paleo traps, this effect is an excellent way of seeding your graveyard with more names that you can bring back to keep applying pressure to your opponent, as with one trap activation, you suddenly have 2 Paleozoics in grave. But it's when Marella sends non-Paleozoic trap cards that you get to see how crazy the card really is, because there are actually quite a few trap cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! With wild graveyard effects, and Marella is a surefire way of using those effects to your advantage. For example, in Paleo-centered strategies, it's not uncommon to see Marella send a copy of Xyz to full height to the graveyard, so that you can later banish it to use its effect to prevent your opponent from declaring an attack on any of your monsters except the one you target. A play that essentially offers up one of your Paleos as sacrifice for your opponent so the rest of your field can survive the battle phase. But Marella's effect also comes up in the likes of Tier Limit Paleo, where getting the opportunity to send a Tier Limit Suliac or a Trivia Karma has a chance to net you some pretty absurd advantage. Or you can even use it in Labrynth Paleo to send Big Welcome to use its graveyard interaction to disrupt an opponent. And all of these are pretty solid uses of Marella. But one card in particular has drastically increased the power of the card, that being Transaction Rollback. Because if you can get Rollback into the grave, you can banish it and pay half your life points to target and copy the effect of any normal trap card in your graveyard. There's no doubts about how insane Rollback as a card is, and can be used for anything from bypassing hard once per turns to straight up locking your opponent out of the game. But in Paleozoic, having Rollback as an option to send with Marella has a particularly strong synergy with the rest of the strategy. You see, due to the graveyard effects of your Paleos, they're always benefiting from being able to mill your deck in some way with the likes of That Grass Looks Greener, Needlebug Nest, or even a Laundry Dragon Maid. As the more cards you mill, the more likely it is you'll be able to set up an oppressive number of Paleos in your graveyard to bring back as monsters. As a result, it's pretty common to see Paleo decks playing a bunch of trap cards that are going to be useful both when drawn and when milled, with the likes of Lost Wind, Dragon Maid Tiding, and of course, Xyz to full height, all having both solid on-field and in-graveyard effects to make them great in most situations. But there's a pretty limited number of trap cards that share this utility, and a Paleo list have always needed to hit a sweet spot of playing enough powerful trap cards to protect your monsters and disrupt your opponent, without playing so many that your mills are hurt as well. However, Transaction Rollback is the perfect solution to this issue, as now every normal trap card that's in your graveyard is a potential resource that can be copied with Rollback, with Marella being the easiest way of getting it to the graveyard so you can use its close to busted effect. Or if you happen to mill Rollback specifically, you can then use Marella to send any normal trap of your choice from your deck to the grave, allowing you to virtually customize your interaction to whatever your opponent throws at you. And it's not just Marella that shares this symbiotic relationship with Rollback, as Lynchia's unique effect is a great way of using your best graveyard effects a second time. Like Marella, this effect is astonishingly simple, because when activated, all it does is let you target a banished card and return it to the graveyard. This pairs pretty nicely with your native strategy, as now any Paleo that you couldn't save from the battle phase, or that got banished when you linked them away, can now be saved from the banishment to be brought out again. But notably, Lynchia doesn't need to target a banished Paleozoic. It can return any banished card, and it just so happens that a lot of the trap cards that we talked about being great with Marella just happen to banish for cost when you use their effects in the graveyard. In most strategies, this cost is usually enough to keep these cards banished, and they have to jump through hoops of sending a second copy from their hand or deck to the graveyard. But in Paleozoic, Lynchia turns every card that banishes for cost into an asset, giving it essentially the same utility as Marella in grindier game states that allows you to reuse a spent Rise to Full Height or Transaction Rollback to swing a game in your favor. Now, there is something important to remember about this effect. Returning a card to the graveyard and sending a card to the graveyard are two different things. If you have a banish Absolute King Backjack, you can use Lynchia's effect to return it to the graveyard. However, you won't be able to trigger its second effect to look at the top 3 cards of your deck because it wasn't sent to the graveyard. It was returned. However, you'll still be able to use its first effect to banish itself and execute the top card of your deck as it's in the graveyard and capable of being banished. This is relatively a small difference in wording, but once again, in a deck like Paleo that's trying its hardest to find as much advantage anywhere it can, these small differences can definitely add up, so they're well worth being aware of. Dinomischus is another Paleozoic with a slight difference in how its first effect is worded that puts it a cut above other cards that do similar things. The effect is pretty simple but highly impactful, as when you flip it up, you can target a face-up card in the field and banish it, but only so long as you discard a card, essentially making the card an archetypal version of Karma Cut. This kind of interaction is still amazing even in the modern day, because while you're trading 2 cards to deal with 1, non-destructive removal that you can use at quick effect speed to deal with your opponent's boss monsters, combo starters, and floodgates is always going to be appreciated, especially because these cards are going to end up banished, preventing them from using their potentially powerful graveyard effects. But there's one key difference between the way Karma Cut and Dinomischus works. The card you discard for Dinomischus is done for effect and not for cost. This small difference has major implications. Not needing to discard until the effect resolves means that if your Dinomischus is negated, you're not forced to minus yourself for no reason. But more importantly, discarding for effect opens up an entire range of graveyard effects Dinomischus can trigger that a Karma Cut couldn't. Although just be aware that since the discard is its effect, if the target removes from the field, you still have to discard even if you have no target to banish. Anyways, because while you could just send a Paleozoic that you can revive from the graveyard later, or a drawn rollback or backjack, this effect, as well as Marella's effects, are the glue that ties Paleozoic tier limits together. Because while Marella is great for sending your tier limit trap cards from your deck to the graveyard, Dinomischus is an amazing way of using the graveyard effect of any tier limit monster, spell, or trap card that you've drawn or added to your hand, which can result from anything from some free advantage if you pitch Scream or Meta Noise, to even ways to disrupt an opponent by triggering the graveyard effects of tier limit monsters, catching your opponent by surprise by suddenly dropping a Rukelos on them in the middle of their turn. Meanwhile, Paleozoic Canadia is just a solid way of interacting with your opponent, as its unique effect lets you target a monster your opponent controls and change it to face-down defense position. Even in the modern era, Book of Moon-like effects are still astonishingly strong, and Canadia is no exception. Getting to set your opponent's best enablers at quick effect speed is a great way to deny your opponent from using their ignition effects, and to stop them from using the body for most extra deck plays, which can be a turn-ending game against decks like Sprite and Kashtira when used at the right time. Although in general, Canadia is a lot more matchup dependent compared to most of the other Paleozoics that you play, because against a deck like Branded or Chimera, a Book of Moon doesn't really do much to slow them down. And unfortunately, Canadia is limited to being only able to target your opponent's monsters and not your own, which would have at least given it some added versatility, as if you knew a Paleo monster was going to be dealt with, you could at least flip it face down so it wouldn't be banished. Even still, Canadia is a pretty reliable option in Paleo-focused decks, as setting an opponent's monster is always going to do something, even if it's just stopping an attack. Olenoids is in a pretty similar boat. Its effect is a stellar piece of utility that can target any spell or trap card in the field and destroy it, but its usefulness is always going to be pretty match dependent. This is a great tool to have against any kind of back row strategy, but even against combo decks, a quick effect pop of any back row can sometimes put a stop to an opponent's turn by popping their activated field and continuous spells to prevent them from resolving their effects, which can be quite useful even against the best decks of the current format. And given the recent rise of monsters that treat themselves as back row, Sometimes you can even use Illinois as a form of removal for your opponent's Centurion or Snake Eyes enablers before they hit the field. However, some decks are almost entirely unaffected by Illinoids, by virtue of just not having a solid potential pop, which, like Canadia, can sometimes put its strength into question. But given its general usefulness to disrupt a wide array of strategies, it's always worth including as part of your main lineup. The same can't be said about every Paleozoic trap card though, and while Marella, Lynchia, Dinomischus, Canadia, and Illinoids are essentially staples, the likes of Paleozoic Pikaia are rarely ever played. On the surface, Pikaia's effect sounds great, as you can activate a discarded Paleozoic to draw 2 cards, which in theory should help you plus by giving you 2 free draws to replace the Pales that has been sent to the graveyard that are going to revive themselves later in the turn, which is eventually a straight +2 in card advantage. However, this effect has its issues, namely being that you have to discard a Paleozoic card specifically in order to use it. And currently, the only main deck Paleozoic cards that you could discard are trap cards. Trap cards that you're going to want to set to the field so that you can use their effects as disruption to stop an opponent, a way to gain advantage by using their effects, or an extra way to bring out your Paleozoics from the grave by being another trap you can activate at any point. If Pikaia could discard any card like Dinomischus, it would actually have some insane utility in both pure Paleozoic variant strategies by getting cards you'd rather have in the grave that you'd want to be there, while also giving you a free draw in the process. But as it stands right now, needing to hold a card in hand that you'd much rather have on the field makes using Pikaia's effect more of a liability than anything else. But it's at least an option that you can have in the back of your mind if you really want to play more Paleo names. Although before Pikaia, it's also worth considering Hallucinagia and Eldonia, even though their unique effects are also not that great. With Eldonia, you can target a monster in the field to give it 500 attack and defense, while Hallucinagia can have the attack and defense of a face-up monster in the field, with both effects lasting until the end of the turn. Being able to manipulate the stats like that isn't a terrible effect. On the contrary, with how small your Paleozoics are, having a way to cut your opponent's monsters down to size while also buffing your own can sometimes be pretty useful if you want to have a more threatening battle phase. But the deck already has its own archetypal ways to deal with your opponent's problematic monsters. That doesn't require that you use your battle phase at all, and while you might be able to surprise your opponent in the damage step once in a while to force them to crash their own monsters, it's actually kind of hard for either Eldonia or Hallucinagia to make your opponent's monsters small enough for your Paleos to beat over them. And you'll actually need to use both at the same time if you ever want to have a chance at beating over boss monsters of the modern era. Instead, if you really need a way to deal with your opponent's high attack boss monsters, or just want a way to find lethal, it's a better idea to look into the extract tools you have available to help with either goal, as there are a ton of amazing options in rank 2 pools that can help you clear away your opponent's field and hard out monsters, or even help you drop an out of nowhere OTK of an opponent. All of which are a lot easier to use than wasting 2 Paleo traps to beat over a Blue Eyes White Dragon. But generally speaking, if you're going into a rank 2, then one of the deck's best options is by far Paleozoic Opabinia, which is usually going to be the extra deck monster that you'll be summoning out the most often in Paleo strategies, even above the likes of Totally Awesome. Because for Paleo, Opabinia is honestly the stronger card between the two. Like the other Paleos, Opabinia is unaffected by other monster effects, which makes it really hard for your opponent to interact with, and a great Zeus enabler. However, unlike the other Paleos, Opabinia isn't a non-effect monster, and has some pretty great effects that give it a ton of value. While you control it, you get to activate Paleozoic trap cards from your hand, which is a great bonus effect to help speed up the strategy by letting you use your Paleo traps as soon as you draw them, rather than needing to wait a turn and for you to set them. But the real meat of this Surf and Turf special is contained in the tail end of Opabinia's effect text, because if it has a trap card as a material, which is likely since your Paleozoics are all trap cards, you'll get the chance to detach a material so that you can add any Paleozoic trap card from your deck to your hand. This effect searches for every main deck card in the archetype, allowing you to customize the card you want to add based on the current board state. If you need removal, you can add Dinomischus or Illinoids. If you need to set up, you can add Marella or Lynchia. Or if you're hoping for some more free draws, you could even add a Pikaia if you're playing it. But even more than the ability to add any card of the archetype, the most insane part about Opabinia is that it allows for Paleozoics to have a genuine resource loop. Earlier we talked about some of the core tenets of the strategy that it's a good idea to follow to get the most out of the deck. Namely, get your Paleos to the graveyard, bring them back from the grave with their own effect, help them survive the turn, and then overlay them for an Xyz monster. And if Opabinia is your Xyz of choice, you get to replace one of the trap cards you use on your opponent's turn, all while putting an extra name in the graveyard ready to summon back. And the best part is, because of Opabinia's other effect, you can just immediately use the trap card you added and revive the detached Paleozoic in response, which gives you the chance to summon out even more Paleo names and access more extra deck monsters, while setting up your graveyard for the next turn if you start something like Marella. But if Opabinia is your reward for making it to turn 3, Anomalocaris is your reward for playing Paleo in general, as both of its effects are honestly absurd and a great reflection of what Paleo is trying to do, but only so long as you can summon Anomalocaris to the field. And sometimes it'll be genuinely difficult, as you need to commit at least 3 level 2 monsters to the field if you want to summon it. But it's more than worth it, as it's essentially the lights out for your opponent the moment it hits the field. Like Opabinia, Anomalocaris has an effect that can help you keep recurrent advantage whenever you use a trap card. Because with its second effect, which on a soft once per turn, when a trap card is sent from the back row to the grave, including at the resolution of a chain, you get the chance to excavate the top card of your deck. And if it's a monster or spell, you send it to the graveyard. But if it's a trap card, you get to add it to your hand for free. This makes Anomalocaris an advantage generating machine, because after you use one of your Paleozoic normal traps in the back row, you get a free gamble to add the top card of your deck to your hand. And given the amount of trap cards a Paleo strategy plays, the odds are definitely going to be in your favor. Especially because in most Paleo strategies, a lot of the monsters and spells that are played often have some kind of solid graveyard effect, or is something that you'd want in the grave anyways. And while there are definitely some dud hits, you'll have plenty of opportunity to trigger an Anomalocaris over the course of a duel. But that's not all, because as well as getting you some free advantage, Anomalocaris can be an oppressive way to lock up a game by taking your opponent's card advantage with its third effect. As on a soft once per turn, if it has a trap card as a material, you can detach an Xyz material quick effect speed to target a card in the field and destroy it. This effect is simple because that's all it needs to be, as it's a great way to counter whatever your opponent throws at you, whether they slam down their boss monster or try to hide behind their back row. Anomalocaris on field instantly checks it. But it's especially wild because, like every other Paleo, Anomalocaris is entirely unaffected by monster effects and can't be negated or dealt with by a lot of conventional means. With other Paleos, this makes it pretty hard to remove them from the field, especially when backed up by the likes of Wabaku. But it's almost impossible to deal with an established Anomalocaris unless you happen to have drawn an immediate out. Because a 2400 attack beatstick that's completely immune from monster effects with the ability to destroy any of its potential outs is a nightmare to deal with. But one that your opponent has to beat if they have any hopes of winning the duel due to the advantage it can continuously generate. Now, the last extra deck monster and card of the archetype are definitely as crazy as either of the other counterparts. But Camboraster is at last a cute utility option the deck has available to it if it needs it. Unlike Opabinia and Anomalocaris, Camboraster specifically needs 2 Paleos to summon it, which is a little bit of an issue because unless your Paleos have been sent from a destructive Karma Cannon, they'll end up banished when used for its Link Summon, which is a pretty heavy investment of resources. At the very least, what you get out of Camboraster is solid. It's unaffected by monster effects, can protect your set cards from being destroyed by card effects by banishing itself from your field or grave, and can even act as a way to get any Paleozoic from deck that you can activate on the same turn by sending a set back row either player controls to the graveyard. This gives the deck an extra way of dealing with an opponent's back row in archetype, while getting what is essentially a free search. And having it in your graveyard can sometimes catch an opponent off guard if they try to wipe your trap cards with a sneaky board breaker before you get a chance to use them. There's no doubt that the card has some strength, but it's not amazing when compared to your other options for the resources you put in, and more often than not, making it Opabinia is going to just be the safer play. But as a whole, Paleozoic is one of the most unique strategies in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and one that requires a lot of skill and a lot of thought to play correctly, with the amount of cards you have to keep track of and remember, despite how simple these trap cards first appear. And if you're not willing to respect your elders, you might just end up as fish food for these ancient ancestors working towards a common goal.